Okay. So, just gonna keep reading. I think this is chapter 2. I don't know. The Bible as the source of anarchy. My next task is to show by a naive reading of the Bible that far from offering us a sure basis for the state and the authorities, a better understanding will, I believe, point us toward anarchy, not, of course, in the common sense of disorder, but in the sense of anarch, no authority, no domination. We commonly talk of sheer anarchy when we see disorder. This is because we in the West are convinced that order can be established in society only by a strong central power and by force, police, army, propaganda. To challenge power of this kind necessarily means disorder. Luther, for instance, was so frightened by the disorder of the peasants' revolt, a consequence of his preaching of Christian liberty, which peasants groups accepted and wanted manifest at once. He quickly called upon the princes to suppress the uprisings. Calvin could even say that anything is better than social disorder, even tyranny. I quote these two authors because they are the closest to me as a Protestant, and in order to show that even faithful readers of the Bible and true Christians can be blinded by the obvious usefulness of kings, princes, etc. They can read the Bible only through this filter. But today, confronted with the crushing of individuals by the state under every regime, we need to challenge this behemoth and therefore to read the Bible differently. It is true enough, as we shall see, that there are also in the Bible texts which seem to validate authority. But as I will show, I believe that there is a general current which points towards anarchy. The passages that favor authority being exceptions. The Hebrew Bible. After its liberation from Egypt, the Hebrew people was first led by a charismatic head, and during its 40 years of desert wandering, it really had no precise organization, in spite of certain hints in Exodus. To invade and conquer Canaan, it then had a military leader, Joshua, but this was only for a short time. Some scholars doubt indeed whether the Hebrew people was a single group of identical origin. As already sketched out, perhaps by Moses, the people settled by clans and tribes. The 12 tribes had their own heads, but these had little concrete authority. When an important decision had to be made with ritual sacrifices and prayers for divine inspiration, a popular assembly was held, and this had the last word. After Joshua, each tribe set about occupying its own territory, for many of the areas, although assigned, had not yet been fully conquered. When the tribes had completed the occupation, an interesting system was organized. There were no tribal princes. Families that might be regarded as aristocratic were either destroyed or vanquished. The God of Israel declared that he and he alone would be Israel's head. Yet this was not a theocracy, for God had no representatives on earth, and tribal assemblies made the decisions. An exception was when the situation became disastrous through successive defeats, through famine, through social disorder, and or through idolatry, and a return to pagan religions. God then chose a man or a woman who had no specific authority, but whom he inspired to win a war or to lead the people back to reverence for God, that is, to resolve the crisis. Apparently, when the judges had played their part, they effaced themselves and rejoined the people. This was obviously a flexible system. God did not necessarily choose people of distinguished family or health. Deborah, Gideon, Tola, Jar, and Samson were more prophets than kings. They had no permanent power. God alone could be considered the supreme authority. A significant phrase at the end of the book of Judges 21:25 is that time there was no king is that at that time there was no king in Israel. People did what was right in their own eyes. Proof may be found in the story of Abimelech in chapter 9. One of the sons of Gideon, with no mandate from God, decided that since he was of the family of him who had saved Israel, he ought to succeed his father in office. He began by assassinating all his brothers. He then assembled the inhabitants of Shechem and Millo, or Beth Millo, and proclaimed himself king. But the prophet Jotham opposed him, and addressing the people, he told them an interesting parable. The trees gathered to elect a king and put him at their head. They chose the olive, but the olive refused, saying that its job was to produce good oil. Then they chose the fig, but it made a similar response. Shall I give my sweetness and excellent fruit which I bear in order to be above the other trees? But the trees wanted a king. They chose the vine, and the vine answered like the first two. They then approached the bramble, which accepted and stated at once that those which disobeyed it would be burned by it. Having denounced Abimelech, Jotham had to flee. Abimelech resigned for 3 years. The Israelites, accustomed to freedom, then began to revolt. Oppression and massacres resulted, but after his victories over the rebels, Abimelech was passing a tower, and a woman up in the tower threw a piece of milestone on his head and crushed his skull. The system of judges was then restored. Hey. The real history of royal power, central and unified power, would begin only with the familiar story in 1 Samuel chapter 8. Samuel was now a judge, but the assembled people told him that they had now had enough of this political system. They wanted a king so as to be like other nations. We note here the attraction of the centralized state. The same thing has been seen in Africa since 1950, as the African peoples have wanted states after the Western model. They also thought a king would be a better military leader. Samuel protested and went to God in prayer. The God of Israel replied, "Do not be upset. The people have not rejected you, Samuel, but me, God. They have constantly rejected me since I liberated them. Accept their demand, but warn them of what will happen." We need to see that this is exactly what the prophets would do, not predicting the future, but warning people what would happen if they persisted in the chosen path. Hence Samuel returned to the assembly of people in Israel and told them that since they wanted a king, they should have one. But they had to know that what this king would do. He would take their sons and make soldiers of them. He would take their daughters for his harem or as domestic servants. He would impose taxes and confiscate the best lands. The people replied, however, that they did not care. They wanted a king. Samuel warned them again that they would cry out against this king, but nothing could be done. He who was chosen to be king thus came on the scene, namely Saul, who, as we know, became mad, committed all kinds of abuses of power, and was finally killed in battle against the Philistines. The second king, David, enjoyed great renown. He was Israel's greatest monarch. He was constantly held up as a model. I have written elsewhere that he was the exception among Israel's kings, but Bernard Eller is harsher than I am. He thinks that David is a good example in favor of anarchy. The first reason is that one of the passages, 2 Samuel 12, 7-9, shows us that David did nothing on his own. It was God alone who acted through him. His glory owed nothing to his ark, but solely to God's benevolence. Eller then shows that during his reign, David did all the things that in later centuries would bring successive disasters on Israel's kings. This is obviously important. And Franz Louis would do all the things which led to the political mistakes of the 18th century and hence the revolution. I don't fucking know Roman numerals. What is that? I think the 14th, Franz Louis the 14th. Furthermore, the Bible curiously insists upon all David's faults. The killing of his rivals, arranging the death of the husband of a woman whom he desired, the incessant civil wars of his reign, so that David is not presented as in any way blameless or glorious. After David came Solomon, his son. Solomon was just and upright, but then power went to his head, as it did with others. He imposed crushing taxes, built ruinous palaces, and took 700 wives and 300 concubines. He began to worship other gods besides the God of Israel. He built fortresses over the whole land. When he died, he was hated by everyone. The elders of Israel advised Solomon's son and designated successor to adopt a more liberal policy, reducing taxes and the heavy yoke of servitude. But Rehoboam did not listen to them, and when the people assembled, he told them, "My father made your yoke heavy, but I will make it still heavier. My father chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scorpions." 1 Kings 12:14. The people revolted. They stoned his finance minister. They rejected the house of David. A division took place. The tribe of Judah stayed loyal to Rehoboam. The other tribes rallied around a former minister of Solomon, Jeroboam. In my view, this whole story is worth telling because it shows how severe the Bible is even on the great kings. It is severe precisely to the degree that these kings represented in their day the equivalent of a state, an army, a treasury, an administration, centralization, etc. Yet this does not exhaust what we have to say about Israel's monarchy. Two important points still have to be made. The first can be summarized briefly. We can say that in biblical accounts, good kings are always defeated by Israel's enemies, and the great kings who win victories and extend their borders are always bad. Good means that they are just, that they do not abuse their power, and that they worship the true God of Israel. Bad means that they promote idolatry, reject God, and are also unjust and wicked. The presentation is so systemic that some modern historians suggest that the accounts were written by anti-monarchists and partisans. It is true that in the Chronicles the presentation is much less clear-cut. The astounding thing to me is that the texts were edited, published, and authorized by rabbis and representatives of the people, if one can say that, at a time when the kings in question were reigning. There must have been censorship and controls, and yet those did not prevent the writings from being circulated. Furthermore, the accounts were not merely preserved but were also regarded and divinely inspired. They were treated as revelation of the God of Israel, who is thus presented as himself an enemy of royal power and the state. They were sacred texts. They were included in the body of inspired texts. There was as yet no canon. They were read in the synagogues, even though they must have seemed like anti-royalist propaganda to rulers like Ahab. They were commented upon as the Word of God in the presence of all people. This to me is astonishing fact which gives evidence of the dominant thinking of the Jewish people from the 8th and 4th century BC. In addition, the same texts and all the prophetic books bring to light a politically very odd phenomena, namely, that for every king there was a prophet. The prophet, in the case of David, was most often severe and critic of royal acts. He claimed to come from God and to carry a word from God. This word was always in opposition to royal power. Naturally, the prophets were often expelled. They were obliged to flee. They were put in prison. They were threatened with death, etc. But this did not make any difference. Their judgment was regarded as the truth. And again, their writings, usually in opposition to power, were preserved, were regarded as revelation of God, and were listened to by the people. None of them came to the aid of a king. None of them was a royal counselor. None was integrated. The prophets were a counterforce, as we might put it today. This counterforce did not represent the people, it represented God. Even sensitives of God in whom the people believed. Even idolatrous kings found it very hard to deal with these representatives of God in whom the people believed. The prophets stated unceasingly that the kings were mistaken, that the sequences which had to be viewed as divine judgment, sometimes the kings appealed to the others who also claimed to be speaking in God's name but to be prophets. There was thus a battle of prophets, but the accounts preserved under Isaiah and Jeremiah show that each time the true prophets prevailed against the false. Here again we find the same strange phenomena as before. None of the false prophecies that were favorable to kings has been preserved in the Holy Scriptures. The struggles of the true prophets have been preserved, however, and the fact that logically the royal authority ought to have suppressed them shows that we have in their declarations the Word of God, as I see it. These facts manifest in an astounding way the constancy of anti-royalist and anti-statist sentiment. Constancy. We are not done yet. We have to add further factors. We are not done yet. We have to add 2 further factors. Toward the end of the 4th century BC, we come across an astonishing book, which is usually called Ecclesiastes, or I can't pronounce that. Qoheleth. This book seriously challenges political power. There's a footnote. It's supposedly the work of Solomon, the great king, the most wealthy and the most powerful. But from the very first, Solomon learns that political power is vanity and a pursuit of wind. He has obtained all that royal power can give. He has built palaces and promoted the arts, but none of that amounts to anything, nor is the only criticism of political power. Nor is that the only criticism of political power. In 316, we are told that in the place established to judge among humans, wickedness is always established, and in the place established to proclaim justice, there is wickedness. The author also sees the evil that there is in what we would now call bureaucracy, a child of hierarchy. If you see in province the poor if you see in a province the poor oppressed and the violation of law and of justice, do not be surprised, for the person who is in charge is watched by a higher, and above them there are yet higher ones. And this text concludes ironically, an advantage for the people is a king honored by the land. 589. But then there is virulent attack on all domination. A person lords it over a person to make him miserable. Finally, irony again. Do not curse the king, do not curse the rich in your bedchamber, for a bird of the air will carry your voice, or some winged creature will tell your words. Thus, the political power has spies everywhere, and even in your bedroom, do not say anything against it if you want to go on living. In conclusion, we must look at the end of the Jewish monarchy. Palestine was conquered by the Greeks and then became part of the Seleucid kingdom. End of the 3rd century BC. Then came the Maccabean revolt to liberate Judea and especially Jerusalem. The War of Liberation was long and bloody, but success came in 163 BC. Many political parties then struggled for power. From a colonial dictatorship, the Jews fell under a Jewish dictatorship, the Hasmonean monarchy, which was not only very corrupt, but was characterized by palace intrigues. One king starved his mother to death, another assassinated his brother. These things made pious Jews hostile to this dynasty, and the people were so disgusted that they preferred to appeal to a foreign king to rid them of their Israelite king. The deposition did not succeed, but we have here an explanation of the hostility to all political power that prevailed in the 1st century BC. The story of the collapse of Israel's monarchy was not yet at end. The Romans came on the scene in Palestine in 65 BC. Pompey besieged Jerusalem and finally took it, a horrible massacre following. When Pompey celebrated his triumph at Rome, Aristobulus, the last Hasmonean king, was among his prisoners. An abominable struggle for the succession then began among the leading Jewish families. Obviously, the law of God and the solidarity of faith meant nothing to the leaders. It was Herod, the son of a protege of Caesar, who was appointed governor of Galilee by the Romans. Herod adopted a harsh policy and restored order in what became a world of dismal brigandage. He put the main brigade leader to death. Guerrilla attacks on political authorities had now become pure and simple banditry. His enemies accused him before the supreme political court, the Sanhedrin, which did nothing and had no real power, on the ground that he had usurped this court's prerogative, it alone having the power of life and death. But Herod, who knew that he had the Roman support, showed such assurance and arrogance before the Sanhedrin that this timid body did not dare do anything against him. Herod returned to Jerusalem with an army, but his father intervened to prevent a new war. His power progressively increased. In 37 BC, became the true king of all Palestine in alliance with Rome. A governor ruled with him, but he was not under the governor. He depended directly on the last emperor of Rome. Equipped with such power, he engaged in considerable political activity. He imposed a tight administration on the whole country with police control. He also began construction. He built whole cities in honor of Augustus and magnificent temple of Augustus. He was one who spread the emperor cult in the east. He also built strong fortifications at Jerusalem. Finally, in 20 BC, he began building a new temple for the God of Israel. He enlarged the esplanade with enormous supporting walls that may still be seen, one of them being the famous Wailing Wall. He also put up sumptuous structure with ornaments of gold, etc. He thus came to be known as Herod the Great, but he could engage in this construction program only by imposing heavy taxes and oppressing the people even to the point of forced labor. Nor shall we forget that after him the country would be delivered up to 150 years of civil war and incomparable devastation. The land was ruined and there were frequent famines. Violence and terror were the instruments of government, and as we can well imagine. The only reality that counted for Herod was the friendship and support of Rome and the emperor. Herod died in AD 4, and the disputed succession gave rise to new civil wars. Rome then seized one part of Herod's kingdom. Finally, one of his sons, Herod Antipas, carried the day and regained part of the kingdom. Antipas led a completely insane life of crime and debauchery. We need to note that is this if we are to understand what followed. How did the people of Israel react to the rule of Rome on one side, which was less severe than that of the Jewish crown, and the violence of the Herods on the other? The curious thing is that, except for the book of Daniel, no more writings were recognized by the people and the rabbis as divinely inspired. Up to John the Baptist, there were no more prophets. What we find are two reactions. The one was violent. This unworthy dynasty and the Roman invaders must be chased out of the country. The country then was not merely prey to conflicts among its leaders, it was also in ferment due to the activity of guerrilla bands, then called brigands, who fought the royal house and Rome by the usual method, attacks, assassination of prominent people, etc. The other reaction, that of the devout, was one of withdrawal from this horrible situation. These pious people established fervent religious communities, avoided secular matters, and devoted themselves solely to prayer and worship. Among them, there developed an apocalyptic trend, on the one hand prophesizing the end of the world, which had long since been announced. When you see the abomination of desolation standing here, it ought not. How better to describe the Hasmonean and Herodian dynasties, and on the other hand expecting the coming of God's Messiah, who would set everything in order and reestablish the kingdom of God. In their different ways, both reactions ascribe no value to the state, to political authority, or to the organization of that authority. Okay, I'll take a break there, I guess. Just gonna continue reading my book here. Getting close to the end. A little over halfway. About halfway. Jesus. Okay, so it starts off with, this was the general climate into which Jesus was born. Speaking of this duality of a king and a prophet, where the king would be sort of tyrannical and evil, and the prophet would speak the truth about God. The first event that Matthew's gospel records concerning him is not without interest. Herod the Great was still in power. He learned that a child had been born in Bethlehem, and that reports were circulating that this child would be Israel's Messiah. He realized at once what trouble this might cause him, and thus he ordered that all the children of 2 years and under in Bethlehem and the vicinity should be killed. The accuracy of this account is irrelevant for my purpose. The important thing is that we have the story, that it was abroad among the people, and that the first Christians accepted it. We must not forget that they were Jews, and put it in a text which they regarded as divinely inspired. This shows what their view was of Herod, and behind him of power. This was the first contact of the infant Jesus with political power. I am not saying that it influenced his later attitude to it, but undoubtedly it left a mark upon his infancy. What I recently want to point out here, by means of a series of recorded incidents, is not that Jesus was an enemy of power, but that he treated it with disdain and did not accord it in any authority. In every form, he challenged it radically. He did not use violent methods to destroy it. In recent years, there has been much talk of a guerrilla Jesus who, the people thought, would chase out the Romans. I think that there are two mistakes here. Nothing supports the account of a guerrilla Jesus, such as we find, for example, in P. Cordonel, who concludes from the cleansing of the temple and the request of Jesus for 2 swords that the disciples had a stock of arms. A single fact shows how impossible is that theory. Among the disciples there were zealots, Simon and Judas, who supported violence, but also collaborators with the Romans. And the 2 groups were able to get on well together. Jesus never extolled violence. If he was a guerrilla head, the least we can say is that he was a fool. His travels, especially the last journey to Jerusalem, made no tactical sense, and they inevitably led to his arrest. Another, and even more widespread error, is that all the Jews were essentially preoccupied with expelling the Roman invaders. Undoubtedly there was hatred for the Goyim, and a desire to chase out the invaders. The massacres perpetrated by the Romans were constantly remembered, but that was not all. In addition, patriotic Jews could not forget that the king of Judea had been appointed by the Romans and could not remain in power without their support. Hatred of even Romans combined with the desire to be rid of the Herods. Even among pious sects like the Essenes, there was an expectation of the coming of a mysterious personage who was a teacher of the righteousness, would not have political power, but who would give true freedom to the Jewish people by establishing not temporal and military power, but spiritual power, as we see also in certain Jewish apocalypses of the period. I would not venture to say that these sects had an anarchist hope, but many of the texts suggest that. When Jesus began his public ministry, the Gospels tell the story of his temptation. The devil tempts him 3 times. The important temptation in this context in the last, in Matthew. The enemy takes Jesus to a high mountain and shows him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. I will give you all these things if you will prostrate yourself and worship me. Or, I will give you all this power and the glory of these kingdoms, for it has been given to me, and I give it to whom I will. If you, then, will prostrate yourself before me, it shall all be yours. Again, my concern is not with the facticity of the records, nor the theological problems. My concern is with the views of the writers, with the personal convictions that they express here. It is not unimportant to emphasize, perhaps, that the two Gospels were probably written with Christian communities of Greek origin in view, not Jews who were influenced by the hatred to which we referred above. The reference in these texts, then, is to political power in general, all the kingdoms of the world, and not just the Herod monarchy. And the extraordinary thing is that, according to these texts, all powers, all the power and glory of the kingdoms, all that has to do with politics and political authority belongs to the devil. It has all been given to him, and he gives it to whom he wills. Those who hold political power receive it from him and depend upon him. It is astonishing that in the innumerable theological discussions of the legitimacy of political power, no one has ever adduced these texts. This fact is no less important than the fact that Jesus rejects the devil's offer. Jesus does not say to the devil, "It is not true. You do not have the power over kingdoms and states." He does not dispute this claim. He refuses the offer of power because the devil demands that he should fall down before him and worship him. This is the sole point when he says, "You shall worship the Lord your God, and you shall serve him, only him." We may thus say that among Jesus' immediate followers and in the first Christian generation, political authorities, what we call the state, belonged to the devil, and those who held power received it from him. We have to remember this when we study the trial of Jesus. A further question is why reference is here made to the devil. The diablos is etymologically the divider, not a person. The state and politics are thus primary reasons for division. This is the point of the reference to the devil. We do not have here a primitive and simplistic image or an arbitrary designation. What we have is a judgment which is not in the least religious and which expresses both experience and reflection. This judgment was obviously facilitated by the horrible lacerations caused among the people by the Hasmonean and Herodian dynasties, and the ensuing uprisings and civil conflict. However that may be, the first Christian generation was globally hostile to political power and regarded it as bad, no matter what its orientation or constitutional structures. We now come to texts which record Jesus' own sayings and which exaggerates regard as in all probability authentic. I read that wrong. We now come to texts which record Jesus' own sayings and which exegete, what the fuck? That's a fucked up word. I'm gonna look this one up. No. Oh, G8. Regard as in all probability authentic. We do not have here early Christian interpretation but the position of Jesus himself, which evidently was the source of this early Christian interpretation. There are 5 main sayings. Naturally, the first is the famous saying rendered to Caesar, I will briefly recall the story of Mark. The enemies of Jesus were trying to entrap him. The Herodians put the question. Having complimented Jesus on his wisdom, they asked him whether taxes should be paid to the emperor. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Should we pay or should we not pay? The question itself is illuminating. As the text tells us, they were trying to use Jesus' own words to trap him. If they put this question, then, it was because it was already being debated. Jesus had the reputation of being hostile to Caesar. If they could raise this question with a view to being able to accuse Jesus to the Romans, stories must have been circulating that he was telling people not to pay taxes. As he often does, Jesus avoids the trap by making an ironical reply. Bring me a coin and let me look at it. When this is done, he himself puts a question. Whose likeness and inscription is on this? It was evidently a Roman coin. One of the skillful means of interrogation used by the Romans was to circulate their own money throughout the empire. This became the basic coinage against which all others were measured. The Herodians replied to Jesus, Caesar's. Now we need to realize that in the Roman world, an individual mark on an object denoted ownership, like cattle brands in the American West in the 19th century. The mark was the only way in which ownership could be recognized. In the composite structure of the Roman Empire, it appealed to all goods. People all had their own marks, whether a seal, stamp, or painted sign. The head of Caesar on this coin was more than a decoration or a mark of honor. It signified that all the money in circulation in the empire belonged to Caesar. This was very important. Those who held the coins were very precarious owners. They never really owned the bronze or silver pieces. Whenever an emperor died, the likeness was changed. Caesar was the sole proprietor. Jesus then had a very simple answer. Render to Caesar that which is all Caesar's. You find his likeness on the coin. The coin then belongs to him. Give it back to him when he demands it. With this answer, Jesus does not say that the taxes are lawful. He does not counsel obedience to the Romans. He simply faces up to the evidence. But what really belongs to Caesar, the excellent example used by Jesus makes this plain. Whatever bears his mark. Here is the basis and limit of his power. But where is this mark? On coins, on public monuments, and on certain altars. That is all. Render to Caesar, you can pay the tax. Doing so is without importance or significance, for all money belongs to Caesar, and if he wanted it, he could simply confiscate it. Paying or not paying taxes is not a basic question. It is not even a true political question. On the other hand, whatever does not bear Caesar's mark does not belong to him. It all belongs to God. This is where the real conscientious objection arises. Caesar has no right whatever to the rest. There's a footnote here. It is extraordinary that J.J. Rosso attacked this saying on the ground that setting the kingdom of Caesar and the kingdom of God in antithesis generates internal division which break up nations. All institutions that bring humanity into self-contradiction, says Rosso, must be rejected. His conclusion, then, is that the state must be the great master of a civil religion, i.e. state religion. Okay, first we have life. Caesar has no right to life and death. Oh, God, yeah. Caesar has no right to plunge people into war. Caesar has no right to devastate and ruin a country. Caesar's domain is very limited. We may oppose most of his pretensions in the name of God. Jesus challenges the Herodians then, for they can have no objections to what he says. They too were Jews, and since the texts tell us that those who put the question were Pharisees as well as Herodians, we can be certain that some of them were devout Jews. Hence, they could not contest the statement of Jesus that all the rest is God's. At the same time, Jesus was replying indirectly to the Zealots, who wanted to transform the struggle for the liberation of Israel into a political struggle. He reminded them what was the limit as well as the basis of the struggle. The second saying of Jesus about political authorities comes in an astonishing discussion. The disciples were accompanying him to Jerusalem, where some of them seemed to have thought that he would seize power. They were arguing who would be closest to him when he entered upon his kingly rule. The wife of Zebedee presented her two sons, James and John, and made the express request that Jesus would command that the two to whom she appointed, though Jesus knew them well enough, should sit one at his right hand and the other at his left hand in his kingdom. We see here once again the general climate of incomprehension to which Jesus lived, for he had just told the disciples that he knew that he would be violently put to death at Jerusalem. He thus said to them first that they had no understanding. He concluded with this statement that is relevant for us. You know that the rulers of the nations lord it over them, and those in high position enslave them. It shall not be among you, but whoever would be great among you must be the servant. Note that he makes no distinction or reservation. All national rulers, no matter what, the nation or the political regime, lord it over their subjects. There can be no political power without tyranny. This is plain and certain for Jesus. When there are rulers and great leaders, there can be no such thing as good political power. Here again, power is called into question. Power corrupts. We catch an echo of the verse that we quoted above from Ecclesiastes, but we note that also that Jesus does not advocate revolt or material conflict with these kings and great ones. He reverses the question as he so often challenges his interlocutors. But you, it must not be the same among you. In other words, do not be so concerned about fighting kings. Let them be. Set up a marginal society which will not be interested in such things, in which there will be no power, authority, or hierarchy. Footnote: one is always astounded when reading the sayings of this kind that the church has been able to set up its own hierarchies, princes, and primates. Do not do things as they are usually done in society, which you cannot change. Create another society on another foundation. Hell yeah. We might condemn this attitude, talking of depoliticalization. As we shall see, this was in fact the global attitude of Jesus. But we must take note that it is not desocialization. Jesus is not advising us to leave society and go into the desert. His counsel is that we should stay in society and set up in it communities which obey other rules and other laws. This advice rests on the conviction that we cannot change the phenomena of power. And this is prophetic in a sense when we consider what became of the church when it entered the political field and began to play politics. It was immediately corrupted by the relation to power and by the creation of its own authorities, which would happen to science too. Finally, of course, one might rightly object the setting up of independent communities outside the political power was relatively easy in the days of Jesus, but no longer possible today. This is the real objection, but it is hardly enough to convince us that we may engage in politics, which is always means of conquering others and exercising power over them. Exactly. So, if power corrupts, then it doesn't matter who's in power because of human nature. So how do we... But we can't eliminate power. So what's... I guess set up fringe societies and do things your own way. Try as much as possible while obeying the laws. The third saying that I want to adduce concerns taxes again, and the question that is put much the same as the one we have met already. We read in Matthew that when they came to Capernaum, the collectors of the half-shekel tax spoke to Peter and said, "Does not your teacher pay the half-shekel tax?" Peter responded, "Yes." And when he came into the house, Jesus said to him, "What do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of the earth take tribute or taxes? From their own sons or from foreigners?" Peter answered, "From foreigners." Jesus then said to him, "The sons are thus free. However, not to scandalize them, go to the lake, cast your line, and take the first fish that comes up. Open its mouth, and you will find a shekel. Take that and give it to them for me and for yourself." Naturally, for a long time, attention focused on the miracle. Jesus was making money like a magician. But the miracle is without real importance as such. On the contrary, we have to remember that the miracles of Jesus are quite different from marvels. He performs miracles of healing out of love and compassion. He performs some extraordinary miracles, example, stilling the storm, to come to the help of people. He never performs miracles to astonish people or to prove his power or to stir up belief in his divine sonship. He refuses to perform miracles on demand. If people say, "Perform this miracle and we will believe in you," he refuses absolutely. This is why faith is not linked to miracles. A miracle of the type found here is thus inconceivable in and for itself. What then is the point of it? Jesus first states that he does not owe the tax. The half-shekel tax was the temple tax, but it was simply in aid of the priests. It was also levied by Herod the king. It was thus imposed for religious purposes, but was taken over in part by the ruler. Jesus claims that he is a son, not merely a Jew, but the Son of God. Hence, he plainly does not owe this religious tax. Yet it is not worth causing offense for so petty a matter, that is, causing offense to the little people who raise the tax. For Jesus does not like to cause offense to the humble. He thus turns the matter into a subject of ridicule. That is the point of the miracle. The power which imposes the levy is ridiculous, and thus he performs an absurd miracle to show how unimportant the power is. The miracle displays the complete indifference of Jesus to the king, the temple authorities, etc. Catch a fish, any fish, and you will find the coin in its mouth. We find once again the typical attitude of Jesus. He devalues political and religious power. He makes it plain that it is not worth submitting and obeying except in a ridiculous way. One might object again that this was no doubt possible in his day, but not now. At the same time, it was an accumulation of little acts of this kind which turned the authorities against him and led to his crucifixion. The fourth saying of Jesus concerns violence rather than political power. It is well-known pronouncement, "All who take the sword will perish by the sword." The preamble to the saying presents a difficulty. According to Luke, Jesus surprisingly tells his disciples to buy swords. They have two, and Jesus tells them that is enough. The further comment of Jesus explains in part surprising statements, for he says, "It is necessary that the prophecy be fulfilled according to which I would put in the ranks of criminals." The idea of fighting with just two swords is ridiculous. The two swords are enough, however, to justify the accusation that Jesus is the head of a band of brigands. We have to note here again that Jesus is consciously fulfilling prophecy. If he were not, the saying would make no sense. But now let us take up the relevant saying which was uttered at the same time the rest of Jesus. Peter was trying to defend his master. He wounded one of the guards. Jesus told him to stop, and in so doing uttered the celebrated saying, which is an absolute judgment on everything that is based on violence. Violence can only give rise to further violence. An important point is that saying is repeated in Revelation. The new and significant factor here is that the reference of the passage is to the beast that rises out of the sea. I have tried to show elsewhere that this beast represents political power in general and its various forms of force. The beast that rises out of the earth is the equivalent of what we now call propaganda. The first beast then is the state, which uses violence and controls everything with no respect for human rights. It is face to face with the state that the author says, anyone who kills with the sword will be killed by the sword. The meaning, of course, is ambivalent. On the one side, we might have here a cry of despair. Since the state uses the sword, it will be destroyed by the sword, as the centuries of history have shown. But we might also view the saying as a command to Christians, do not fight the state with the sword, for if you do, you will be killed by the sword. Again, therefore, we are orientated toward non-violence. The trial of Jesus is the last episode of his life that we need to consider in this context. He was tried twice, once before Sanhedrin and once before Pilate. Before going into his attitude, we must first deal with the preliminary question. Most theologians, including Karl Barth, take it that since Jesus agreed to appear before jurisdiction of Pilate, showed respect for the authorities, and did not revolt against the verdict, this proves that he regarded the jurisdiction as legitimate, and we thus have here a basis for the power of the state. I have to say I find this interpretation astounding, for I read the story precisely the opposite way. What does he look like? It's all blurry now. Is you snoozing? He's tired. I was trying to make him tired running around the apartment with a string he was chasing. Pilate represents Roman authority and applies Roman law. Now I concede that no civilization ever created so well-developed law or could give such just decisions in trials, debates, and conflicts. I say this without irony. I taught Roman law for 20 years and discovered all the nuances and all the skill of jurists whose one aim was to say what was right. They define law as the art of the good and the equitable, and I can guarantee that in hundreds of concrete cases they rendered decisions which showed that they were in effect dispensing justice. The Romans were not, in the first instance, ferocious fighters and conquerors, as they were often described. Their chief achievement was Roman law. A little problem which virtually no one considers is that their army, strictly speaking, was never large. At the most, it seemed to have had 120 legions, and they were nearly all stationed on the frontiers of the empire. They came into the interior only when there was a rebellion. The order of the empire was not a military order. It was through administrative skill and through the equilibrium established by skillful and satisfying legal measures that the empire endured for 5 centuries. We have to bear this in mind in evaluating what the accounts of the trial tell us. The law of which Romans were so proud, and which provided the just solutions, What did it accomplish in this instance? It allowed a Roman procurator to yield to the mob and to condemn an innocent man to death for no valid reason, as Pilate himself recognized. This, then, is what we can expect from an excellent legal system. The fact, what's happening now is exactly that. Like, these prosecutors are yielding to the Black Lives Matter mob and throwing innocent people in jail. Amazing. So, not much has changed in 2,000 years, guys. It's just an illusion. This idea of progress is a total fucking illusion. The fact that Jesus submits in the trial is not in these circumstances a recognition of the legitimacy of the authority of government. On the contrary, it is unveiling the basic injustice of what purports to be justice. Exactly. This is what is felt when it is said that the trial of Jesus, all those who were condemned to death and crucified by the Romans are cleared. We thus find here, once again, the conviction of the biblical writers that all authority is unjust. We catch an echo of the saying in Ecclesiastes that where the seed of justice is found, there rules wickedness. Now let us look at the sayings and attitude of Jesus during the trial. There are differences among the four Gospels. The sayings are not exactly the same, nor are they made before the same persons. At times, the Sanhedrin, at times Herod, at times Caiaphas. But the attitude is always the same, whether it takes the form of silence, of accusation of the authorities, or of deliberate provocation. Jesus is not ready to debate, to excuse himself, or to recognize that these authorities have any real power. This is the striking point. I will take up in order the three aspects of his attitude. First, there is silence. Before the chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin, Jesus is silent. All the accounts agree that they sought witnesses against him, and they did not find any. But finally 2 men said that they had stated that he would destroy the temple. Here, hold on, I need a drink. My voice is getting better. Sometimes I'll not talk for like a month, and then it's hard to talk. Jesus answered nothing. The authorities were astonished and ordered him to defend himself, but he remained silent. The same was true before Herod. Herod had him appear because he wanted to talk with him, but Jesus did not answer any of his questions. Before Pilate, Matthew and Mark tell us that he adopted the same attitude. This is the more surprising in the view of the fact that Pilate could condemn him, and he was not a priori unfavorably disposed to him. Many people were accusing him before Pilate. The chief priests brought many charges, and Pilate asked him if he had no answer, but he did not reply. His attitude was one of total rejection and scorn for all religious or political authority. It seems that Jesus did not regard these authorities as in any ways just, and that it was thus completely useless to defend himself. From another point of view, he took the offensive at times, and manifested disdain or irony. Thus, when asked whether he was the king of the Jews, according to 2 of the 3 accounts, he made the ironical reply, "It is you who has said so." He himself would make no statement on the matter. They could say what they liked. Second, his attitude involves accusation of authorities. Thus he said to the chief priests, "I was with you every day in the temple, You did not lift a hand against me, but now you have come out with swords as against a brigade. Behold, your home has come, and the power of darkness. In other words, he expressly accused the chief priests of being an evil power. John records a similar episode, but with a different reply that is half irony and half accusation. When the priests Annas asked him about his teachings, Jesus replied, I have spoken openly to the world. Why do you question me? Question those who have heard me. They know what I said. When one of the officers struck him for this insolent answer, Jesus said to him, If I have spoken wrongly, prove it. But if I have spoken rightly, why do you strike me? Along the same lines of accusation, there is another ambiguous text in John. Pilate said to Jesus, You refuse to speak to me? Do you not know that I have the power to free you or to have you crucified? And Jesus replied, You would not have the least power over me unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me to you is more guilty than you. The famous from above has been taken differently. Those who think political power is from God find in it confirmation. Jesus is recognizing that Pilate has his power from God, but in this case, I defy anyone to explain what is meant by the second part of his reply. How can the one who has delivered up Jesus be guilty if he has been delivered up to the authority which is from God? The second interpretation is purely historical. Jesus is saying to Pilate that his power was given to him by the emperor. I have to say, though, that I can make no sense at all of this view. What point is there in Jesus telling Pilate that he depends on the emperor? What is the relevance of this to their discussion? Finally, there is the seldom advocated interpretation that I myself favor. Jesus is telling Pilate that his power is from the spirit of evil. This is keeping in with what we said about the temptations, namely that all powers and kingdoms in this world depend on the devil. It is also keeping in with the reply of Jesus to the chief priests that we quoted above, namely that the power of darkness is at work in this trial. The second part of the saying is now easy to explain. Jesus is telling Pilate that he has his power from the spirit of evil, but that the one who has delivered him up to Pilate, and therefore to the spirit, is more guilty than Pilate himself. Obviously so. If we accept the fact that these texts, which undoubtedly reproduce an oral tradition relating to this attitude, if we accept the fact that these texts, which undoubtedly reproduce an oral tradition relating to the attitude of Jesus at the trial, and probably contain his exact words, formulate the general opinion of the first Christian generation, why did the writers not state clearly that Pilate had his power from the spirit of evil? Why did they record so ambiguous a text? I think that the matter is simple enough. We must not forget that the gospel was written at a time when Christians were coming under suspicion, and when certain texts were put in code so that their meaning would not be clear. Third, we find provocation on the part of Jesus. Thus, he's purring. I can hear you purring all the way over here. Hey. Hey, is he snoozing? Aww. Thus, when the high priest asked him whether he was the Messiah, the Son of God, he replied, It is you who have said so. He added, Hereafter you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. In relation to the whole theological teachings of the time, this is derisive. What's he saying here? The words clouds is often misunderstood. For the Jews, the terms heaven, and especially heaven of heavens, did not denote our blue sky with the moon and sun. Heaven is the dwelling place of God. It denotes what is inaccessible, heaven of heavens, an absolute superlative. Makes this point. As for clouds, they simply denote the impossibility of knowing, of penetrating the mystery. They are the veil. Painters who depict Jesus marching on clouds are grossly mistaken. Jesus did not say that he was the Christ, or that he would be at the right hand of power. He did not say I. He said the Son of Man. For those who are not very familiar with the Bible, it must be pointed out that Jesus never said himself that he was the Christ, or the Son of God. He always called himself the Son of Man, the true man. He was obviously mocking the high priest when he said, "Hereafter, that is, from the moment you condemn me." We find the same reply in the Mark, and it seems to have been uttered by Jesus himself and handed down to the first Christian generations. Similar provocation is recorded in John. This is the time before Pilate, as so often happened. Jesus was trying to disconcrete Pilate. When Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you?" Pilate replied that he was not a Jew, and that all he knew was that the Jewish authorities had handed Jesus over to him. He thus repeated the question, and this time Jesus made the ambiguous reply, "My kingship is not of this world, hence I am not competing with the emperor. If my kingship were of this world, my companions would have fought in order that I might not be handed over to the Jews." Pilate ignored these subtleties and insisted, "So you are king?" This was the only charge on which he could condemn Jesus. Jesus, as we have seen, already answered, "It is you who have said so. I myself have nothing to say on this subject." He then added, "I was born and I have come into this world to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth understands my word." Pilate then put his last question, "What is truth?" Jesus made no reply. He had no teaching to give to Pilate. Once again, we find a kind of underlying mockery, a defiance or provocation of authority. Jesus spoke to Pilate in such a way as not to be understood. In this lengthy series of texts relating Jesus' face-to-face encounters with the political and religious authorities, we find irony, scorn, non-cooperation, indifference, and sometimes accusation. Jesus was no gorilla. He was an essential disputer. And that's where we're going to end for today. Or for now.
With 1 beer, 2 beers, 3 beers, a shot of whiskey, a margarita, and a Bloody Mary. What? 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 You gonna flap your gums about what Triple H is gonna do to me? Over the top rope? 29 people? You're gonna kick Denver's ass? What? What's up? What? 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 What?
You realize
realize you might not have an opponent at your pay-per-view? Huh? What? What? Do you know that he might have hurt his neck? You know he's in the hospital? What? What? Does it look like I care, Michael? Does it look like I give a rat's ass about Kurt Angle? You want to come out here and bother me, asking me, do I know this? Do I know that? What? Huh? What? Does it look like I care? Do you care? Tell me, do you care? Do you care? Do you care? Do you care? What? I'm itching inside. My liver's all twisted up. You know what I did? I took Temple, went to the liquor store. I loaded up with alcohol, more specifically vodka, whiskey, beer, tequila, more beer, more vodka, more whiskey, and more beer. I'm a little pissed off. I take that up. I'm really pissed off. Last night, I had Chris Jericho right where I wanted him. I told the world I would put his sorry ass right here, drop him, wham! Stone Cold Stunner, 1, 2, 3, Stone Cold, Stone Cold, that's me. You got something to say to me? You want to talk about the Royal Rumble?
Yeah, I'd love to ask you about the...
What?
I'd love to ask you
What?
about...
You want to ask if Stone Cold is going to win the Royal Rumble?
Yeah, who's going
It's
to...
Stone Cold. I said Stone Cold. Stone Cold. What part of Stone Cold do you not understand? 29 pieces of trash. Over the top rope. That includes Triple H, Kurt Angle, The Undertaker. The bottom line is Stone Cold Steve Austin is going to win the Royal Rumble and go to WrestleMania, and that's the bottom line. Why? Because Stone Cold